Rebecca Mannis, thank you for joining us once again on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. It's so good to see you.
It's wonderful to see you, and thank you for hosting me.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Rebecca. It's been a little while, but we have had chats and emails and bits and pieces. So good to see your lovely face again.
So, Rebecca, catch us up and let us know what you've been up to.
So I'm continuing to live and work in the Big Apple in Manhattan, while also working with people across the United States and really across the globe. It's been an interesting phase, given that schools and individuals, families are at different stages in terms of back to life post-COVID, and having an opportunity to think about some of the priorities that await individuals and institutions. Of course, families are institutions, thinking about those. Among that, things such as learning loss, thinking about how to return to a hybrid workplace, say if you have ADD. And one of the main areas that my colleagues and I are particularly thinking about is long COVID, how to address the cognitive and stress and health responses that some people have after this inflammatory illness.
Right. Now, this is nothing new in terms of, dealing with assaults on the brain and our nervous system. So how are you and your colleagues approaching these difficulties?
Yeah, well, as a colleague recently wrote, we have to recognize that for some people, there's going to be what he referred to as a tidal wave of symptoms and what we sometimes call sequelae, after effects, that are impacting some people. And one of the realities that we're grappling with as a discipline is that this inflammatory response, which is really what long COVID is, can take so many forms. So in the same way that Lyme disease, concussion, seizure can impact the brain in different ways, medically based cognitive issues impact the whole person, and they also can impact a person's thinking in different ways. The COVID can get into different parts of the brain, into the lungs, and so that in turn impacts the individual's experience. While we don't know that much about the specific long-term trajectory of COVID because it's a new disease, we do know quite a bit about how to, sorry about that, Paul Simon, how to approach the reality of other medically based difficulties and ways that they're actually quite different from developmental cognitive difficulties such as ADD and dyslexia. And so that's really the challenge for us as clinicians.
Because what's interesting, sort of just putting aside the fact all the human struggle and difficulties and emotional distress that COVID, just trying to talk about the subject itself for a second, is that it's really brought to people's minds the interconnectedness that we have. Because as we were just sort of chatting there, I was jotting down some of the different things that have been coming up. I mean, the COVID certainly has major effects on the lungs. So this is post-recovery from the seriousness of the disease.
Indeed.
Leads damage. It has serious, now we're starting to see it has serious effects on heart. So not exactly also where the sinoatrial rhythms are being affected. Of course, what you were just saying there, COVID actually is a viral infection that moves into the brain. But of course, we know, we had a wonderful podcast a little while ago with John Leaf, again, talking about the cellular work and the conversation, that the messages that the T cells bring all through the body and the brain.
Indeed.
And suddenly people are going, oh my God. And I've got a client who had an early Epstein-Barr virus earlier in life, which is now fired up. And she's finding herself only able to actually manage on an energy level for somewhere between an hour and a half, I suppose what Ernie
Yes.
Rossi and I would call the ultradian sort of rhythm of energy, but then they're actually depleted after that. So there's perhaps only 2 or 3 hour or so areas of activity they can do. So for those people who
Indeed.
are dramatically affected, it's very dramatic. So on that
Yeah,
sort of framework,
yes.
please fill us in on any of the details on some of that.
Well, I think that your analogy and the insights that you're drawing from this client are spot on. They're really a metaphor for how we can grapple with coming to learn about long COVID and how to help people, while also not being threatened by that, but rather building upon some of what we've learned about how to work as a team, and also what we know about the field of neuropsychology. You know, Epstein-Barr is another example of a virus that, as you said, impacts energy level, it impacts thinking, it impacts what we call cognitive tempo or pacing at which we process information. And in fact, a lot of the current thinking is that some of the symptoms are connected to these cytokine storms, which is sort of like when the inflammation turns on the system and causes your system to have a hyper response. In many ways, that's very similar to ME/CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome.
Chronic fatigue, yes.
And so among the many thinkers who are really trying to understand this is Dr. Susan Levine, an immunologist in New York City at Cornell Medical Center. And she's really been at the forefront for exactly that reason. So while long COVID is new, we know, for example, about Epstein-Barr, we know about Lyme, we know about chronic fatigue, and we can use that information to empower our clients and to try to think as a team. One of the other things that you may have discussed in this earlier podcast is that one of the particular realities is that there's not a direct correlation between severity of COVID and severity of long COVID symptoms. So in other words, a person may have unfortunately had a mild case of COVID and yet have very significant fatigue, very significant difficulty with what we call working memory, or being able to take in and then absorb and systematize many details. And that really throws people for a loop. They're like, oh, my throat was bothering me a bit, but I got over it in 2 days. And yet when the person goes back to work, now it's a hybrid workplace, needs to prioritize what to work on at home, what to plan for when a particular associate is in-house. And suddenly that's very difficult, affecting executive functions, another area we've certainly discussed in the past.
So what are there some foundational principles that we can work with here as psychotherapists? So, you know, we're not neurologists, we're not doing any sort of medical intervention, but what are the principles for psychotherapists who are doing primarily talk therapy to support these people?
Sure. So I think there are a number of helpful thoughts. Number one is, let's think as a team. Okay. There's a difference between neuropsychological testing, which does serve a function. It's the flag I often wave in understanding how to address cognitive issues. But we know that neuropsychological testing, as important as it is a snapshot. It's sort of like a high def snapshot or, say, mini video. That's different from IRL in real life. In the same way, you are likely picking up on details from your conversation with your clients that are very informative. You're also hearing patterns. You're hearing the clients say that there's anxiety, but it's secondary to being unclear about how to manage time or deal with fatigue. You're noticing whether a particular client is having a hard time following longer sentences, whether you're finding that the person fizzles out during discussion, or maybe warms up once you get back into discussing and the engine gets revved for the themes. So that's number one, that there's critical information that therapists have based on those conversations and patterns. Another, did you have a thought about
so
that?
that's still the diagnostic part. That's an understanding of what's going on. And then, then you're going to go on to intervention.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the question, what do we do with that?
Yeah.
So I think one piece is that we can encourage our clients to really, I call it be your own CEO, to be in charge. After all, they're the experts of their own experience, and to really think through what that means in terms of that window of tolerance. Is it that I can get going in the morning when I'm feeling sharper? Is it that I know I discussed this with my mate the other day, but when I'm with my life partner, I really need to have a list of the priorities that we discussed because I get exhausted. Another theme is that we know that executive functions, being able to systematize and sequence, and working memory, being able to hold information and manipulate it, and also processing speed, the pace that we take in information and use it. Those are hallmark areas that seem to be particularly tough for people with long COVID. They're also areas that tend to be tough in general for people with medically based cognitive issues, whether it's Epstein-Barr, whether it's concussion, whether it's Lyme. So, well, what does that mean? It means that the more that our clients have systems to physically track information, to visually see it.
Yeah.
And that is an enormous stress reducer. When I worked with somebody in the Emirates the other day. We do a lot of using whiteboards to track information during our Zoom appointments. That's something that you can do in a Zoom appointment or right in the office. So helping our clients think through how to prioritize, but to do it by physically manipulating information and having a reference point.
Because there's a few things really interestingly just going on here, because of course quite a few of those elements of poor working memory, lack of focus, draining of attention are things that can be symptomologies on the basis of still held trauma, of long based PTSD and so on and so forth. So
yes,
what I'm hearing, and I'll just tell you what I'm hearing, and then please discuss it. To be looking at changes, in this performance. You went through a beautiful list there of working memory, being able to hold sequences.
Yes.
Yeah, that was great. Everybody just tick those down. But the other question that just comes into my mind, I know that when a client comes in, I want to find out what their sleep is. I want to find out what their diet is. I want to find out what their exercise is. Basic sort of programs. Now, it seems that it would be very helpful for me as a psychotherapist to know if they've had COVID or not. But are we still at a point where that's a testing privacy question? To blatantly sort of say, and if you've done this, this, and have you had COVID? What are we at there with the sensitivity that people have to declaring or admitting it, those different other emotional things of guilt or well, I don't know. What thoughts do you have? I mean, there has to be thoughts because we're still processing all this.
I think it's an excellent point. What you're really saying is that we want to think about the whole individual and we want to think about pacing. My guess is that some people will come in with some thoughts. They may say, I found that since COVID, it's just way too hard to get started. Among neuropsychologists, there is a whole ongoing discussion about issues of malingering This is very much the case in terms of concussion, for
Oh,
example,
yeah,
in
it's been around for a
Lyme,
long time. Yeah. Mm.
right? Where some people feel, the person's claiming that that's what it is. In reality, the person had a history of trauma. In reality, the person is just interested in cutting back, and the person has to just get back on the proverbial horse, right? So that, of course, is something to think about. But regardless of whether it is long COVID, or maybe the person's misattributing and needing to just get back onto a schedule, obviously step one is to listen to what the person has to say. I would say that that your approach, which is really trying to think about sleep cycle, nutrition, exercise, also helps us think through and helps us open the door toward those discussions. Are you noticing that there's a difference in your exercise pattern? Oh, you're saying that you're finding that it's hard to really catch your breath, and that it's not just a matter of not having gone to the gym for the past month. So I think that that's very important.
Yeah, we need to maintain, and if not increase, our sensitivity to what the client is telling us, because it is very hard to know that there are these things to be concerned, but not to become really an invader of their jump in too quickly. We've got to wait for them, don't we, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's a few confounding sort of things. I mean, when you're talking about fatigue, short, memory and speed of process, all of this could also be correlated with chronic stress and chronic inflammation from just the whole situation that we've been through in the last 2 years. And so, regardless of a viral infection, these things can have, a severe impact. And the other thing is, vaccination. We're hearing, people getting vaccine injured as well. And there's another variable,
Yes.
to throw into the mix. And I guess at the end of the day, whatever the causes are,
Sure.
we can't do anything about that. What we're left with is how to treat the patient moving forward. And I think
Yes.
Because there are so many confounding variables that can lead to this symptomatology, we really I think it's good to get a full picture, get as much history as possible. But the key thing is working with what you have right in front of you. Would you agree?
I would agree. And I think the other part of it is to sort of demystify it with them, to say, look, this is something that we're all really learning about. What we can do, I sometimes joke, I say we want to understand the broader information, but then we want to look at, going back to a little bit of our statistics here, we want to look at an N of one. In the end, we care about the individual in front of us. So we want to use the information and the insights that we know more globally, but then each person is so unique. And that's particularly important, particularly, I think, empowering for clinicians and for clients. Why? Well, we know that typically when there's a medically based cognitive issue, okay, first of all, it has to be that there's a stress factor. There's an element of grief, reality, having responsibilities, especially if we're talking about adults. Okay. So there's that. The other reality is that the norm among people who have had a medically based acquired issue is that they retain a lot of their prior intellectual ability, but these difficulties manifest as they need to apply skills to new areas. Shall I give you an example?
Yes,
Absolutely.
please.
So as an example, let's say a person has had, again, we're talking here about not a significant brain injury, right? We're not talking, heaven forbid, about something that just knocks a person out where their intelligence is totally depleted from a horrible injury, right? But let's say a person had Lyme, or a mild concussion, or ME/CFS, or might have had radiation therapy for cancer as an adult, or long COVID. what tends to happen is that the person's reasoning stays strong and the person's basic skills, the person's, here I'm being a little bit of a learning specialist, wonk, okay? The person's ability to decode long words, right? We would not expect that a person would have trouble recognizing sight words if given an achievement test of common words. But when that person needs, let's say the person is an attorney and the person needs to absorb case material for a new referral, the person may know that, retain that there are certain patterns about a certain statute of limitations, and that would stay strong. But that person may find that following a meeting on a Zoom call and having to come up with the words to communicate a plan is harder in real life.
Right.
That person may find that getting through 100 pages of a PDF to identify the salient points is harder. That person may find that figuring out how to prioritize use of the paralegal takes more steps. And that can be very confusing and very stressful. Then, of course, when we add the reality of new technologies that we all need to get used to, again, switching gears, and the reality of our society expecting people to produce quickly, right? With Zoom, you can just add a document to a chat box in a nanosecond. But is the person able to synthesize the information and lay out an outline immediately?
So
these are very interesting things.
So just taking that example, so you have this attorney, you know, who's your client.
Yes.
And what would you be doing, like in practical terms?
So we'd be doing a number of things. First of all, I would be speaking with folks like you, because you would have insights perhaps of the person's experience before. Okay. So if this is somebody with whom you've worked before, it's very helpful for me to hear your insights. To give you an example, a colleague of mine had found that it was really important with some of her clients who had medically based learning issues. It was important for her to have a Zoom background that was less visually complex, because they just couldn't focus on what was being said with a busy backdrop. Okay. You may know that it's important for me to check in with the client about that person's sleep schedule, or about that person's propensity to spend a bit too much time on the internet before going to sleep, and what that does with the blue light, what that does to that person's circadian rhythm. You may know that this is a person who tends to be able to absorb more information when she's feeling more calm, and that having used Headspace was very helpful. So that's number one. One of the things that I'll often do is take a look at neuropsych testing, or just try to think through practically, kind of be an armchair clinician or brain person with the student, and try to think through, are you a person who likes to talk things through? Are you a person who likes to physically be doing things? I've got my little Post-it pad here. For many people, physically writing things down and moving around the Post-its helps them sequence information much better than just discussion. So that's a big part of what we would be doing. Because working memory and executive functions can be compromised, and because having to work with new information can be so tiring, just as Richard was saying, another thing that I'll do quite a bit with folks is have them try to think about the subroutines or the mini aspects of a task, and then have them estimate how long they think things will take. You may know about the Pomodoro method. That's one useful method. I can send you a link if you'd like. There are some lovely apps and Google plugins. But the idea of Pomodoro, which is just one method, is try to think about working for 20 minutes. What do you think you can accomplish in 20 minutes? And then take a break. And what I encourage people to do is to estimate or predict what they think they can do, or how much time a task will take. I encourage them to then leave 50% extra time, and then time themselves, not for everything, but maybe for 1 or 2 activities a day, because they may find that certain things just are much more complex than they expected. And it's adding to their stress that it's more involved. They may find that there are other things that they're avoiding or catastrophizing. And when they get going, we call that task activation. When they get going, actually, it's much smoother and much more efficient than they anticipated. You can also hear that I'm encouraging people to think about when it's useful to use the paper and pencil and when it's useful to use one of many wonderful apps that are out there.
So there's a lot there about simplifying things, isn't there? I love this, what you brought up about visual processing. And I understand that when you're in a very busy environment, like my office with, is visually very stimulating, and visual processing takes, even if it's unconscious, the things that we're not aware of, our visual processing is going on, even though we're not cognitive of a lot of what we are seeing, where we're focusing on one thing. Still, I understand that if you clean up your work area, if you make it very simple and clean, and be a minimalist, then there's less cognitive processing that needs to go on in the visual realm, and you can use that cognitive power for what you're focusing on, and breaking down tasks, and all the a lot about simplicity. It's beautiful.
Well, I just realizing this very simple thing, as we were talking about saying, make your workspace area and all that sort of bits and pieces. I don't look at that behind me. I think if that were in front of me as in a day-to-day basis, I'd go bananas. In front of me is actually very simple. I've just got my screen. I've got a few notes on the side there that function. I've got certainly bits of paper on my desk, but it's all fairly small. So we're actually, and particularly on Zoom, we're then asking people to look at all that sort of stuff. I know when I'm sitting down in my little office area, my area where I'm working with clients, that's very peaceful. I've just got some chairs and some plants and some very simple things, and people can choose which chair. I have 3 chairs around the room, so they can choose which one makes them comfortable. But when we go onto this Zoom thing, we've actually got that. So I guess, and there's all the, but that's just an interesting thought to say. And what I wrote down was, it's wise and useful for us in our co-creation of managing life to supplement with external enhancements, saying, okay, and by knowing about it, saying, I know that what we need to do is we need to itemize, the left brain needs to itemize things, and they're not itemizing well what they're doing. Okay, how about we try this thing with the Post-it notes? Does that help you itemize, gives you an external enhancement? That's what, and well, I've got the bingo, so I'm just, I go, oh, I see what you.
That's the, I'm actually thinking of 4 take-homes that I think really the two of you have just articulated. And maybe this is a little basic, simplistic, but I appreciate that what we want to do is sort of think theory and then some useful tips.
We like simple. We like simple.
Sure. So number one, while it's true that something like a backdrop may be difficult, it's, again, that's the opportunity for us to all be armchair neuropsychologists and to help people think about what that information means. So I'll just throw out, that's the beauty of the whiteboard, right? It's very interesting to be keeping, and you've heard me say that being able to write things down and have people refer to it helps in terms of their processing and their memory. So having, let's say, an agenda or some take-home themes on the whiteboard, number one, then you download it, you can text it or email it to your client, and it's great for everybody to then refer to, look at a bunch of them. But number two, it gives the opportunity to provide a more neutral space, and then to discuss with the person, what do you think? What about using the whiteboard is helpful? Are you noticing a difference when I'm off in the corner, or and we're writing some things interactively? What do you think that means in terms of how to, so let's use the whiteboard. Let's use it as an opportunity to think about what helps or hinders. Number two is this idea of, we want them to be able to have something to look at, because again, we want them to be able to be both you've heard me say this before, efficient and effective. One of the challenges of working with complex detail, right, and manipulating it is that it taps into those very vulnerabilities of processing speed, mentally filtering, being able to make a plan and to execute it, right? And we know that COVID has been found in the frontal lobes quite a bit. We think it goes through through the olfactory nerve, and that's one of the areas in the brain where it seems to lodge. So it would make sense that that's difficult, along with are all adapting to needing to juggle so much. So doing things like having the whiteboard or another referent. I have a colleague who uses voice memos, another way to go. Also, for some clinicians would like this, others would not. But I do a lot of texting clients in between appointments. Okay. Now, I'm a learning specialist. I'm not a licensed psychologist. And of course, there are confidentiality and other issues of that sort that are very important. But those texts are often a way to stay in touch and to give people those visual reference. I would also say that it's been very interesting for me because a big component of my practice is working in a more holistic way and kind of doing case management. And so clients are often hiring me because they want that follow-up in between. And that's an interesting thing for clinicians to think about. So we've talked about the whiteboards, we've talked about texting. Third thing, having these discussions with clients is a way of trying to help them learn how to keep self-assessing, both in terms of stress. And for example, Richard, you were talking about, is this tapping into a trauma feeling, but also in terms of this area of metacognition, understanding their own thought process, right? Yeah. So, oh, it's interesting when, Matt, when you wrote down for me, think about the yoga. Note if ending early helps my sleep cycle. Write down 2 things and whether they take longer than you expect. You know, that was really helpful when I'm studying for that exam, or when I need to figure out what to do before I pick up my kids from school. Here's how I can apply, we call that transfer of training, right? Here's how I can turnkey it. So there's that metacognition piece. I'll just throw out number 4. I'm going to mention somebody whose research I've discussed before and just show this book, Reader Come Home, by Professor Marianne Wolf. I've mentioned her research before. She was at Tufts University for many years, and she's now at UCLA. She's a literacy professor. She actually she did her doctorate at the place where I did my master's, and I have tremendous regard for her as a professional and as a human being. But one of the things that Marianne wrote about in Reader Come Home, one of her many wonderful books, is she really summarized research she had done with colleagues around the world that showed that the nature of reading involves many different brain circuits. I think I mentioned to you in the past, she cleverly calls it the circuit du soleil. She has the different parts that are lit up. Yeah. And one of the things that she found in this Reader Come Home research with her colleagues worldwide is that people tend to overestimate what they feel they're comprehending and absorbing when they read digital content. I think I mentioned in the past, she calls this the biliterate brain. And what she means by that is that the way that it may be different for our grandkids, maybe for 3-year-olds who grow up learning with plastic brains how to read these days, but at least for us, where a lot of our systems are in place, when we are reading print, okay, which also could be holding an iPad below our eyes, the saccade or the sweep of our eyes is different. And the way that we absorb information is more effective than when we're reading digital content and PDFs.
Wow. And so yes, what's directly in front of you. Yeah, that's right. That movement of the eyes that we don't realize is there. And interestingly, that movement of the eyes, that little shake of the eyes that we have evolutionarily, was the thing that enabled us to be able to focus on dangers, on things that were moving in still environments. And so when the way that nature adapts the qualities it already possesses in order to enable to embrace changes in, and particularly in social evolution, is quite fascinating. Is quite extraordinary, and that was really that's fired off so many buttons in my head. I've got a couple of other books on eyesight and things. I'm going to rush off and remind myself of this: what you're looking at directly in front of you, and what you're looking at that is down lower. That's a really interesting aspect, but not wanting to diminish to take concentration away from these beautiful four elements. But it's because I just go back. I mean, I use a whiteboard in my office face to face, which because it creates a beautiful little external thing. But it's just a matter of learning how to do that. And I see on the Zoom thing, the whiteboard thing, I just saw the fuss of that, and that idea of something to work with later, I mean, which fits in so much also with the ultradian rhythms that Ernie Rossi and I talk about, that every hour and a half to 2 hours, you have a reviewing, an energetic flow. So having something to work with when you come to points that you can work with it, and they are there. So that's lovely. And the fact that you text people, I do that with selected clients as well. I don't encourage it too much, because otherwise you'd spend your whole day on the text. You've got to be careful.
That can happen.
That metacognition, allowing both you as the therapist to explore their metacognition, so that the neurocognitive, or what we call maybe sometimes the psychometric testing, giving some indications of that. So that's for you as well, and for them. And then going back now again of looking at the changes in capacities that are going on with this electronic environment, as different or in sort of complementarily to the face-to-face environment. I mean, that's just my quick sort of excited response to the four things that you've just put together.
That's a great summary. And unfortunately, my short-term memory is just stuck on this point that I'm justified in buying all of these hard copy books.
Oh yes, indeed. There's a reason you've got some important things on those bookcases. So
That's right.
Absolutely, and actually building upon what you were saying, Richard, it's very interesting because while I've spoken a bit with Professor Wolf, who's again an incredibly gracious professional, I've spoken with her a bit during COVID, but this book predates COVID. One of the things she writes about, and is particularly focused at UCLA, builds upon what you were saying, Richard. You were talking about this from almost an anthropological or sociological point of view in terms of scanning, taking in information and interacting. One of her other points, which is really very much resonates, she says, if people think that they understand more than they do, as they're scrolling through a PDF or reading digital content, not only is it a problem because they don't really understand the information, she says, to your point, Richard, it creates a gap in what she refers to as reading empathy. She contends, how can we truly understand the perspective of the reader and then react to it and incorporate that person's point of view if we don't truly understand what the person has written? And so really that's a 21st century literacy bent on the very point that you've made.
Yes, it is that fascinating thing. I mean, of speed reading, reading faster, of learning to scan, of learning to minimize. And after many years of investigating a lot of those things, and also being an actor for so long, and also being a writer, I've actually returned, or I have for many years, but I've returned my focus saying, like, after looking at all that, what is important is every word. Is every word in its connection to the other words? Is the rhythms and patterns that those words then create? Is the phrases and then the clauses that then come out of it? And by going to these things where you just jump to individual words or quick look at phrases, you are missing that whole point of what has emerged from the writer. Who is trying
Yes.
to express themselves. And people say to me, I say, oh, you could have made that much simpler. I said, yes, I could have. But then you wouldn't have got the depth and the richness. What do you want? Do you want Shakespeare not to give you the 5 metaphors?
Yes.
Or you just want the one you like? And this is, of course, the fast system of modern society, which we're still evolving. And now COVID, gosh, maybe coincidentally, it's forcing many of us to slow down. Interesting.
Yeah, and to the points that each of you made earlier, it's an opportunity for us to think about what this means in understanding people's experiences. It's an opportunity for us to think about our related disciplines and how they can coalesce. Right. Yeah. It's also an opportunity to help our clients have a sense of agency. As an example, Richard, often when I'm working with people who must use PDFs, for example, schools are often providing only digital textbooks. Imagine getting over Lyme disease or long COVID and being told you need to only use an online textbook, or you can only take a test in what they call computer adaptive way, meaning scanning the computer screen and clicking a button instead of pencil in hand and circling key information. Challenge, big area of my work is advocating. But in any case, going back to it, part of what we can do is remind people that the more they're using their reasoning and the more that they experiment with techniques that draw upon the reality of these skills, right, the better they can adapt. As a silly little one-off, very often when it doesn't matter if it's a law student, an executive, or a 4th grader studying about tides, we'll often take a look at things like headings, section headings, and we'll have them try to self-assess. How much did I take away from the past 3 paragraphs? And sometimes we'll be a bit reductionist and we'll think about what's the what, what's the so what, what's the meaning, what's the significance? And that's something where a person can then say, yeah, I've pulled that out. I've got that. I can rephrase it. How can I use that when I'm leading the meeting with my client? Or, I'm really fatigued. In order to pull that out, it takes more time. What do I need to do with my schedule so I've got enough time to do that? How much should I be using a PDF editor and putting a little bit in my own words, because that keeps me more focused? Where am I going to store those notes so that I have them all in one place, along with the book that Matt gave me, so that when I'm writing my paper, I can systematize the information.
Well, I think that's a beautiful description. It's just we have this great difficulty which has been cast upon us, but is it also what opportunity can we take from it, and all those beautiful things you've described there that allow us to re-examine, re-explore, and of course, what is to my great heart is to open up possibilities, new elements, things that are not yet known and not yet thought about, or different combinations of what we've done. And I think we probably have to wind up pretty much now.
Yeah.
We've done our time. But what you said there was such a lovely collection of ideas, and hopefully everyone listening will just go back and review the last 10 minutes of the speech. I think there's been a lot that's been said here.
Yeah, wonderful.
So what do you think? Is there anything more, Rebecca? Have we said everything that we can, or is there something that's particularly missing, or are we able to wind up now? How are you feeling?
I'll just throw out something which I think we've mentioned before. I've got my copy of Alexander Luria, Higher Cortical Functions in Man, with me, and also she passed away last year, Muriel Lazak's Neuropsych Assessment. We're at a particular stage in the field that we all have, and this particular specialty of applied neuropsychology. And it's always been a building process. And I think that this COVID situation is a challenge. It's also the opportunity for us to think about how to move the information forward, how we can work together, and also how we can really keep the client front and center, giving them agency. And I'll just say, I think I mentioned to you in the past that a wonderful neuropsychologist, Jane Holmes Bernstein, who was for many years at Children's Hospital in Boston, once came to speak to us learning specialist students at Harvard's Ed School. And she said a good neuropsychologist should be able to be stranded on an island and be able to do testing and understand the individual using the water, the sand, and a stick. And
yes.
really, that has always, and that was 35 years ago, it really still resonates because we have tools, we learn, we take workshops. In the end, the job for us as individual professionals, what we can encourage our clients to do and what we can think as a team is, how do we use this information to really help craft an experience that moves the individual ahead? We use those tools, but ultimately it's about thinking about the individual, trying to be systematic and creative. And with that, we're going to manage, and God willing, they'll be able to find ways to compensate and grow in good health.
Wonderful. Wonderful thoughts to leave us with. Well, Dr. Rebecca Mannis, it's been wonderful catching up once again. Thank you so much for meeting with us today.
Thank you. And it's always a pleasure. Keep up all of your wonderful work and sharing of information among folks in the field.
We will. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Rebecca.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.